In episode 21, titled OSINT, People and Org Footprints, we're going to focus on a specific kind of open-source intelligence that matters a lot in real engagements and shows up indirectly on Pen Test Plus questions, people data and organizational footprints. The reason this category is powerful is that systems are built, configured, and operated by humans, and humans create patterns that reveal access paths and weak points even when the technical surface looks clean. When you understand how roles, teams, and workflows are structured, you can form better hypotheses about where privileged access exists, where approvals happen, and where errors are most likely to occur. This is not about targeting individuals, and it is not about being intrusive. It is about understanding the operating model that shapes the environment you are authorized to assess. Pen Test Plus often rewards candidates who can connect organizational reality to technical risk without crossing ethical lines. By the end of this episode, you should be able to describe how people and org clues guide safer, smarter testing priorities. Organizational structure clues help you understand how decisions are made, how responsibilities are divided, and where boundaries exist between teams and systems. Public traces can reveal which teams own infrastructure, which teams build applications, and which teams operate security controls. And that matters because ownership influences how quickly fixes can happen and how changes are governed. Vendor references can reveal what platforms or services the organization relies on, which can shape both exposure and constraints, especially when third-party terms or shared responsibility boundaries are involved. Decision makers can sometimes be inferred from public leadership and program roles, which helps you understand who has authority to approve changes or respond to urgent findings. These clues also help you recognize likely choke points, such as a central identity team, a network operations team, or a change management group that controls production releases. In exam reasoning, organizational structure clues can explain why certain escalation paths exist and why constraints like change freezes matter. When you treat the organization as a system, not just the technology, your workflow choices become more realistic and more defensible. Job postings are one of the most common system sources for technology signals, and the value is that they often reveal technologies used, tool families, and maturity hints without requiring any direct interaction with systems. A posting that mentions specific responsibilities can imply what platforms are in play, what development practices exist, and where the organization is investing, which can correlate with recent changes or ongoing migrations. Job postings can also hint at security maturity, such as whether the organization emphasizes secure development practices, monitoring, or identity governance, though these are hints rather than guarantees. They can reveal whether a team is understaffed or rapidly growing, which can indicate operational pressure that increases the likelihood of rushed changes or misconfiguration. On Pen Test Plus scenarios, these kinds of signals show up as background context that can explain why a certain exposure exists or why a certain control may be weak. The key is to treat job posting signals as directional, not definitive, and to use them to build hypotheses that you validate later through authorized testing. When you interpret postings cautiously, they become a helpful guide without becoming a source of overconfidence. Naming conventions for users and email are another pattern that can support hypothesis building, because organizations often follow consistent formats across accounts and communications. If you can infer a naming pattern, you can reason about how identities are likely structured, how roles might be expressed, and how access workflows might be tied to identity systems. These patterns can also hint at organizational segmentation, such as separate formats for contractors versus employees, or separate address spaces for business units. In exam contexts, the important point is not to guess identities aggressively, but to recognize that consistent naming patterns can influence how authentication and access governance is implemented. Naming conventions can also reveal where common errors occur, such as inconsistent handling of identity aliases or confusion between similar names, which can create operational weaknesses. Ethical discipline matters here because the goal is to understand patterns, not to collect or misuse personal data. When you treat naming conventions as context, you gain insight without crossing lines.
Role-based access assumptions can help you predict where privileged rights are likely to exist, which is useful for understanding risk and prioritizing validation steps.
Certain roles are more likely to require administrative access, such as infrastructure operators, identity administrators, security operations staff, or application deployment engineers, and those roles often sit near high-impact controls. The point is not to assume an individual has a specific privilege, but to understand that certain functions require certain access, and that these access requirements create risk if governance is weak.
In many organizations, the most critical access paths flow through identity and access management processes, ticketing approvals, and privileged workflows that can be misconfigured or inconsistently enforced.
Pentest Plus questions sometimes hint at role-based boundaries through scenario details about who can approve changes or who can access specific systems, and your ability to reason about roles helps you choose realistic actions.
Role-based thinking also helps you frame impact because compromise of a privileged pathway can have a much larger blast radius than compromise of a standard user pathway.
When you use role assumptions carefully, they become a map of potential risk concentration, not a list of targets. Third-party relationships often shape the real security boundary of an environment because contractors, partners, and shared support channels introduce trust relationships that may not be obvious from purely technical clues. Contractors may have access that differs from employees, and partner integrations may create pathways that bypass normal controls if governance is weak. Shared support channels can reveal operational workflows, such as where incidents are reported, how access is requested, and what processes are used to escalate issues, which can influence both risk and response. In Pentest Plus scenarios, third-party relationships also raise terms of service and authorization questions, because client permission may not automatically extend to platforms operated by others. A mature OSINT mindset recognizes these relationships as boundary factors rather than as convenient entry points, meaning you treat them as constraints and hypotheses that require careful handling. If a scenario suggests third-party ownership or shared responsibility, the best answer often involves clarifying authorization and respecting platform rules. Understanding these relationships helps you avoid scope mistakes that look like technical progress but are professionally unacceptable. Public announcements can reveal migrations, outages, or rushed changes, and those signals can matter because rushed change is one of the most common drivers of exposure. Announcements about new platforms, rapid scaling, incident recovery, or service changes can imply that systems are in flux, and systems in flux often have temporary misconfigurations or incomplete controls. Outage communications can reveal what services are critical, how the organization communicates under pressure, and where operational focus is concentrated, which can shape what high impact looks like. Migrations can also suggest new identity boundaries, new infrastructure patterns, and transitional periods where old and new systems coexist, creating complex trust relationships. On exam scenarios, migration and change pressure often show up as timing constraints and operational sensitivity, and public announcements can help you understand why those constraints exist. The ethical use of these signals is to treat them as context for prioritization and safety planning, not as permission to probe aggressively. When you incorporate change signals thoughtfully, you build more realistic hypotheses about where risk may cluster. Social media risks are another category of people-focused OSINT, and they tend to be about oversharing, travel, and implied internal processes rather than about technical details. Oversharing can reveal internal terminology, project timing, support workflows, or even operational stress, which can indirectly suggest where mistakes or shortcuts might occur. Travel patterns can imply when key staff are away, which can affect response readiness, though ethical testing does not exploit individuals or personal circumstances. Implied internal processes can appear in posts about deployments, incidents, or team routines, which can give you a picture of how change control or approvals work in practice. Pentest Plus expects you to understand that social channels can leak useful context, but it also expects you to respect ethical boundaries, because collecting and using personal details inappropriately creates harm. The best professional use of social media signals is to strengthen your understanding of organizational workflows and constraints, not to pressure or manipulate people. When you keep the focus on process and posture, social media becomes a context source rather than a temptation.
Ethical boundaries are especially important in people-focused OSINT because the distance between context gathering and harmful behavior can shrink quickly.
Avoid harassment, avoid impersonation, and avoid collecting unnecessary personal data, because those behaviors are both unethical and often illegal, and they are not part of professional penetration testing practice.
ON should be aligned with authorization, scope, and minimum necessary evidence principles, meaning you collect what supports testing objectives and risk communication, not what satisfies curiosity.
Even when information is publicly accessible, you should consider whether collecting or aggregating it increases risk, especially if it involves individuals rather than systems.
Pentest Plus scenarios that include OSINT elements often test whether you recognize these boundaries and choose safe, professional actions that respect them. Ethical OSINT protects the organization and the tester by keeping the work defensible and aligned with trust. When you can state these boundaries clearly, you demonstrate the kind of judgment the exam is trying to measure.
Now, walk through a scenario where you build a target profile from public people clues, because this is how the thinking becomes practical. Imagine you see public traces that indicate a company recently expanded its cloud operations, is hiring identity-focused roles, and references a major vendor partnership in several places. From this, you form a hypothesis that identity permissions and cloud configuration are likely to be important risk areas, especially if the expansion was recent and governance is still maturing.
You also notice that the organization describes a centralized operations team and a formal change management process, which suggests strong constraints around uptime and timing.
You infer a likely naming convention pattern from public contact formats, which hints at how identities may be structured, but you treat it as a hypothesis rather than as a fact.
The result is a profile that identifies likely priorities, such as identity permissions and configuration exposure, and likely constraints, such as change windows and escalation paths. This profile does not replace technical validation. It makes technical validation more focused and safer.
The next step is converting people clues into safe technical testing priorities, and the key is to turn organizational context into a defensible plan rather than into assumptions about individual behavior.
If people and org clues suggest that identity is central, you prioritize validating access boundaries and permission assumptions within scope, using controlled methods that respect safety and data handling rules.
If clues suggest that change is rushed, you prioritize confirmation steps that reduce risk and avoid disruption, especially in production. If third-party relationships appear significant, you prioritize clarifying authorization boundaries and respecting terms of service constraints before touching anything that may not be client-owned.
If naming conventions and roles suggest certain access pathways are critical, you use that insight to focus on controls and governance, not to target individuals.
In exam terms, this conversion is what makes OSINT relevant.
It guides the best next step toward evidence-based, constraint-aware actions.
When your priorities flow from context to safe validation, you demonstrate mature professional reasoning.
There are common pitfalls in people and org footprint work, and knowing them keeps your OSINT thinking grounded.
Outdated org charts and outdated public information can mislead you because organizations reorganize frequently and titles often lag behind real responsibilities. Misleading titles are another pitfall because a job title does not always reflect actual access or influence, and over-relying on titles can create wrong assumptions.
Overconfidence is a broader pitfall, where you treat public traces as proof rather than as clues that require technical validation.
Another pitfall is confusing vendor mention with ownership, because a vendor relationship does not necessarily imply how systems are configured or what is exposed.
The professional approach is to use OSINT as a hypothesis engine and validation guide, not as a source of certainty.
When you remember these pitfalls, you stay humble and evidence-driven, which aligns well with exam expectations.
A short memory line can help you structure what you look for and what you record, and a useful one is roles, tools, vendors, naming patterns.
Roles reminds you to understand who does what and where privileged workflows likely exist, without turning individuals into targets.
Tools reminds you to watch for technology and process signals that hint at maturity and operational habits, especially around identity, monitoring, and change control.
Vendors reminds you to identify third-party relationships and shared responsibility boundaries that affect authorization and constraints.
Naming patterns reminds you that identity structure tends to be consistent and can shape how access is governed, while still requiring careful ethical handling.
When you carry this line, your OS stays structured and purposeful rather than drifting into random browsing.
It also keeps your notes focused on what supports safe, authorized testing decisions.
If you can recall this line quickly, you can run a clean OSINT analysis in your head during scenario questions.
In this episode, the main idea is that people and organizational footprints can reveal access paths, workflow constraints, and risk concentration points, but only when used ethically and treated as hypothesis building rather than as certainty. Organizational structure clues, job postings, naming conventions, role assumptions, third-party relationships, public announcements, and social media signals can all contribute to a target profile that guides safer technical priorities. Ethical boundaries matter most here, because people-focused OSINT must avoid harassment, impersonation, and unnecessary personal data collection, staying aligned with authorization and minimum necessary principles. Convert people clues into safe priorities by focusing on controls, workflows, and constraints rather than on individuals, and guard against pitfalls like outdated information and misleading titles. Now profile one role mentally by describing what access that role likely needs, what controls should govern that access, and what risk would exist if governance is weak, because that exercise turns OSINT into practical security reasoning. When you can do that, OSINT stops being trivia and becomes a disciplined input to safe, effective testing decisions. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.